It was the kind of news that made the world stop in its tracks. 11 years after Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 disappeared without a trace, a man walked into a U.S. consulate in Southeast Asia, thin as bone, barefoot, his eyes sunken like someone who had seen the other side of hell. His name, Daniel Grant, an American passenger who was on that doomed flight. The media storm exploded within hours. Governments scrambled. Families of the missing gathered with a mix of hope and terror. And when Daniel finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, cracked, like it had been locked away for a decade. But every word that came out carried the weight of something darker than anyone imagined. He began by describing the night of March 8, 2014. The Boeing 777 lifted off from Kuala Lumpur, bound for Beijing. Everything was normal for the first hour. Passengers slept, whispered conversations hummed through the cabin, and the soft glow of the seatbelt signs pulsed overhead. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. The aircraft lurched violently, and every screen, every instrument, every electrical heartbeat of the jet went black. No announcements came from the cockpit. No flight attendants rushed to calm the panic. It was as if the plane itself had been cut adrift from the world. Outside the windows, Daniel swore the stars shifted, like the sky itself bent in ways it shouldn't. People began to scream. Babies cried. A businessman tried to stand and was thrown hard against the ceiling as the plane nosed downward. And then silence. Not the silence of calm, but the crushing void of something unnatural. Daniel described it as if the world itself had been muted. No engines, no wind, just the hollow beat of his own heart. When the plane stabilized, no one knew where they were. The windows showed no sunrise, no horizon, only a strange, endless fog that glowed faintly from within. The passengers clung to each other, whispering prayers, demanding answers. But the intercom never crackled. The cockpit door never opened. Hours passed, or what felt like hours. Time itself was unreliable in that place. Some swore it had only been minutes, others claimed days had passed between blinks. Hunger came quickly. Thirst followed, and then the shadows began to move in the mist outside. Daniel's voice shook as he described them. Figures without form, tall, shifting like smoke, pressing against the cabin windows, watching. Some passengers swore they heard whispers in languages no human tongue could form. Others said they saw faces of loved ones long dead, grinning in the fog. And then, one by one, the passengers began to vanish. Not taken by force, not dragged screaming. They would simply stand up, walk calmly to the door and open it as if stepping out into solid ground. But outside there was nothing. Only mist, and yet they never fell. They were just gone. Daniel said he wanted to scream, to stop them, but something pressed into his mind. A voice not his own whispering. Daniel paused when recounting this part, his hands trembling, his eyes darting toward the corners of the room, as if expecting the mist to seep in even here, even now. The officials interviewing him leaned forward, pens shaking over their notepads. What he described next wasn't just about survival. It was about madness. After the first few passengers disappeared into the fog, panic spread like wildfire. Mothers clutched their children. Men tried to barricade the cabin doors. Some even attacked the windows with metal cutlery in a desperate attempt to break free. But the glass wouldn't shatter. It didn't even scratch. The plane was no longer a machine. It was a cage suspended in nowhere. The flight attendants had vanished too. Every knock on the cockpit door went unanswered. Some claimed they saw movement behind the reinforced door, shadow pacing back and forth, but when they screamed for the pilots to open up, no sound emerged from their own throats. Their voices had been stolen. Daniel said that was the worst part. The silence. Not just around them, but inside them. They could open their mouths, but no sound came out. It was as if the mist outside had reached into their lungs and stolen language itself. Only the sound of footsteps remained, the soft scuff of shoes against the aisle as more passengers were compelled to rise and leave. He described a young woman, maybe 25, who had been sitting across from him. She clutched a rosary so tightly her palms bled. She resisted longer than most, whispering prayers that had no sound. But one night, if you could call it night, she stood, eyes glazed like glass, and walked to the exit. Daniel grabbed her wrist, begged her not to go, but her skin was icy. Her lips moved in silence. She looked at him, eyes wide, and mouthed a single word: hunger. Then she pulled free and opened the door. The fog swallowed her whole. Food ran out within what felt like days. Though time bent and fractured, some tore open seat cushions searching for crumbs. Others drank condensation from the windows. Daniel confessed he had eaten the leather from his shoe. Chewed it until his gums bled. But the worst hunger wasn't in the stomach, it was in the mind. The mist seeped into dreams. Passengers woke screaming without sound, clawing at their eyes, claiming they saw things when they closed their lids. Cities burning, oceans boiling, the dead climbing from mass graves, and the whispers grew louder. No longer faint murmurs outside the windows, but clear voices inside their heads. They spoke in perfect English now, promising release, promising peace if only they stepped out. Some resisted, clinging to each other. Others welcomed it, walking into the fog with relieved smiles. Daniel said the line between sleep and waking blurred. Sometimes he wasn't sure if he had stood and walked to the door himself. He remembered gripping the armrest so hard his nails broke, terrified his body would betray him. Then came the first body, a man who refused to leave, who tied himself with belts to the seat frame. He was strong, defiant. But one morning he was dead, his skin gray, his eyes black pools staring into nothing. And worst of all, the whispers celebrated. Daniel swore he heard them laugh. Daniel leaned closer as he spoke, his voice dropping so low the room seemed to contract around him. Every detail was carved into his memory like scars that would never heal. The man who died tied to his seat was only the beginning. After that, more passengers began to wither, their bodies collapsing into pale husks. Some looked as though they had been drained, like every drop of life had been siphoned out during the night. Others vanished entirely, one moment there, the next gone, with only their empty clothes crumpled in their seats. The survivors stopped sleeping. They couldn't, because when they closed their eyes, the mist moved inside the cabin. It seeped through the seams of the fuselage, curling around the seats, brushing against their skin with a coldness that felt like knives. Daniel said that sometimes it took form, shapes crouching in the aisles, crawling over the armrests, long fingers stroking the faces of the terrified passengers. When the lights flickered, the shapes were gone, but the sensation of being touched lingered. He described one night, or what he thought was night, when the fog outside finally parted. Beyond the windows was no sky, no sea, but a vast black void filled with floating lights. At first they thought it was stars, but then the lights blinked like eyes, hundreds of them all staring back. And somewhere in that endless dark, something moved, massive, slow, as if the mist was only its breath, and the plane had been caught inside its lungs. The whispers grew unbearable. They no longer tempted, they commanded. Step out. Join us. The world you left is dead. Passengers began to break. Some clawed at the walls until their fingernails tore away. Others fought each other for scraps of food, even though no food remained. And every few hours, another seat went empty. Daniel said he tried to count how many were left, but the number never stayed the same. Sometimes there were 20 survivors, sometimes 50, sometimes only 5. He swore the plane itself was lying to them, reshaping reality, making them doubt their own eyes. And then came the first sound, the only sound in that suffocating silence. A knock from the cockpit. Every head turned. The door, which had remained shut since the beginning, rattled as something pressed from the other side. Daniel said the sound wasn't like knuckles against wood. It was wet, heavy, a thud like raw meat being dragged across metal. The survivors rushed forward, desperate to see their pilots, desperate for answers. But when the door finally cracked open, they didn't find men. They found faces, dozens of them, mashed together in a shifting wall of flesh, eyes rolling, mouths opening and closing in voiceless screams. The faces pressed against the crack, their lips moving in sync with the whispers in everyone's heads. Some passengers fainted. Others dropped to their knees, praying without sound. One man laughed hysterically until blood poured from his mouth. Daniel? He ran to the back of the plane, covering his ears. Even though the voices weren't in his ears, they were inside. That was when he realized the cockpit hadn't been locked to keep them out. It had been locked to keep it in. Daniel's voice cracked when he reached this part of the story. His hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white, as if even remembering risked pulling him back into that place. After the cockpit door shifted open, everything changed. The mist no longer stayed outside. It began pouring into the cabin, rolling down the aisles like living smoke. Passengers screamed silently, clawing over one another to get away, but there was nowhere to run. The faces pressed against the cockpit gap multiplied, mouths gaping wider, stretching into impossible shapes. Their eyes glowed faintly like coals burning deep underground. Then the mist began to choose. It wrapped around one of the passengers, a young boy no older than 10. His mother tried to hold him, tried to keep him anchored to the seat, but the fog lifted him into the air. His body arched backward, his mouth wide in a soundless scream before he simply dissolved. His skin peeled away in strips of ash, his bones disintegrating into dust that scattered through the cabin. The mother collapsed over the empty seat, her own body shriveling as if drained by grief itself. The survivors scattered, but the plane was no longer a plane. The aisles stretched on forever. Doors appeared where there had never been doors. Some ran into lavatories that twisted into endless tunnels, their screams lost in corridors that didn't exist. Daniel swore he saw a man run toward the emergency exit, only for the entire wall to become a mouth, swallowing him whole. He stopped trying to make sense of it. Logic had no place there. The only thought in his head was survival. Daniel said the whispers changed then. They stopped commanding him to leave. They began speaking to him directly, addressing him by name. Daniel Grant, we know you. We know your fear. We can end it. He doesn't remember how long he resisted. Days, weeks. He was starving, delirious. His skin clung to his bones. His gums bled from chewing leather. But he clung to one thing, his father's voice, a memory from childhood. His father used to tell him, "Fear is the leash, son. If you break it, nothing can hold you." Those words became his anchor. One night, or what passed for night, he found himself standing at the emergency exit. His hand was already on the handle, his body moving without his consent. The whispers hissed, "Open it! Open, open!" But just before he pulled, he looked down and saw something, a reflection in the metal. His own face, but older, gaunt, hollow-eyed. And behind it a figure, a man in a pilot's uniform, whispering into his ear. The captain. His mouth moved with the same words in Daniel's head. That was when Daniel realized the pilots hadn't vanished. They were the conduit. They had opened the way. He ripped his hand off the handle, screamed into the silence, and ran. His feet carried him to the back of the plane, where the rear galley warped and twisted into something else, a doorway of light, faint but real, different from the fog, warm. The whispers shrieked. The faces screamed without sound. The mist clawed at his body, tearing flesh, breaking bone. But he leapt through, and when he opened his eyes, he was lying in a jungle alone. Daniel sat in silence for a long time before he continued. His escape had not been salvation, it had been exile. He woke in dense jungle, the air hot and wet, his skin torn and bleeding. The sounds of insects and birds crashed against him like an alien symphony after years of silence. At first he thought he had returned to Earth, but he quickly realized nothing was familiar. The plants were too large, the air tasted metallic. The sky had no sun, only a dim red glow like twilight frozen in time. He wandered for days, maybe weeks, drinking from black pools of water that made his stomach twist, eating leaves that left his tongue blistered. At night, the fog returned. It didn't surround him fully, but it crept between the trees, whispering, calling. Sometimes he saw the faces of his fellow passengers in the mist, their mouths open wide, reaching for him. Sometimes he saw himself, an older, hollow version, grinning with teeth filed sharp. Daniel found ruins eventually, structures half buried in vines, stone blocks carved with symbols that hurt his eyes when he looked too long. He slept inside one of them, but the carving shifted when he closed his eyes, showing the same faces he'd seen in the cockpit wall. Always watching, always whispering. The worst discovery came weeks later. He stumbled into a clearing and saw the wreckage of another plane. Smaller, rusted, torn apart by vines, but the logo was American, an airline that had gone missing decades before. Inside were skeletons slumped in their seats, mouths frozen in silent screams. Their plane had landed here too. Daniel wasn't the first. He knew then he wouldn't be the last. Years passed, or what felt like years. He stopped counting. The whispers never stopped. They circled his thoughts, promising release, promising escape. And sometimes, when he slept, he dreamed of Earth, not as he had left it, but burning cities in ruins, oceans boiling. He began to wonder if maybe the voices were telling the truth, that he had slipped into the future, that the world he had left behind no longer existed. But then, 11 years later, he woke up on the edge of a road in Southeast Asia. His body was whole, his wounds healed. Cars honked as they swerved around him. A farmer found him, terrified by the wild man who stumbled barefoot into traffic. Somehow, impossibly, he was back, and yet he swore he had never left. Daniel leaned across the table in the interview room, his hollow eyes locking with the officials. "I didn't escape," he whispered. "They let me go." One of the agents asked why. Why him out of all those souls? Daniel's lips trembled as he answered, "Because they wanted me to bring a message." He leaned closer, his voice little more than breath. "They're not finished. Flight 370 was only the beginning. The mist is hungry. It knows our skies now. Every time a plane disappears, every time a radar blip vanishes without explanation, that's not chance, that's feeding." The room went silent. One of the interviewers reached to turn off the recorder, but Daniel's last words bled into the microphone. "They're coming back. And next time they won't take just a plane. They'll take the whole sky."